Chapter 7. Wilfred escapes with Delilah. That's when Diana and Argo started to battle. Diana said, "Why do you hold back so much?" Argo said, "You think I want to fight you?" Diana said, "You might after what we did to your friend's Rigetti jet." Argo said, What did you do?" Meanwhile, inside the tavern, Elle said, "It looks like the Rigetti girl is fighting Deborah's friend." That's when Deborah saw Rod on the ground, dead as a doornail. Deborah said, "Oh no, Rod!" That's when Deborah started to cry. Deborah said, "Who did this? Answer me!" Andrew said, "I did it." Deborah said, "Liar! It was the Rigetti there, wasn't it?" Nick said, "As much as he was an excellent bartender, he was asking for it." Deborah said, "You sick and twisted Rigetti, you're mine." That's when Deborah charged at Sasquash. Elle said, "You go there, girl. Seriously, I bet everything on the Rigetti." Deborah said, "What did you say? You weren't saying that when you, me, and Maya were having a menage." Andrew said, "What? And I cuffed you to the bars and played patty cake with you?" Miriam said, "That was me, you ignoramus." Nick said, "Wow, you're bad." Andrew said, "Okay, big deal, so I didn't remember who I did it with." Pollyanna said, "That is a major no-no." Sasquatch said, "Listen, whatever he owes you, I'll pay from my own pocket." Elle said, "Beat it, Rigetti. It doesn't concern you." Outside the tavern, Delilah devises a plan to mess with the Rigetti girl. Delilah said, "Hey, Diana, let's go grab Wilfred and his game's Rigetti cycles so we can head out." Diana said, "I'm pretty busy at the moment." Delilah said, "Knock her into the tavern already." Diana said, "What about Deborah?" Delilah said, "Forget her. She'll survive." Diana said, "I don't think Deborah would like that." Deborah said, "Oh no, Diana." That's when Deborah raced out the tavern and sidekicked Argo across, knocking her on the deck. That is when they got Wilfred and his game's Rigetti cycles from the front end of the tavern. Deborah said, "Sayonara, sucker." Argo said, "Delilah, you come back here." Hey you! I'm a part of the Rigetti Warriors and I'm taking over your vehicle." Hannah said, "Well, Argo, if you needed a ride, why didn't you tell me?" Argo said, "Well, you see, Delilah and her gang held Wilfred in his..." Hannah said, "Say no more. We got this. Hold on tight for dear life." Argo said, "Hold on to what?" That is when Hannah sped through the area with Argo. Hannah said, "Awesome, isn't it? Great on speed, great on mileage." Meanwhile, at the tavern, Nick said, "Here's the plan. I'll pay for his debt. In return, he will clean up your horse's poop." Andrew said, "This again? Really, Sheriff Nick?" Miriam said, "The deputy's going nowhere with you." Nick said, "Miriam, you can't be serious. Put the blaster down and we can talk some business." Miriam said, "Likely sorry, Sheriff, but he can't be trusted, not after what he did with my girls." Nick said, "But that creep doesn't deserve the dragging he did for having you and him sneak in your girls to my jailhouse and entertain my prisoners. But if you let us go, including Sasquatch, I'll pay for the services that the deputy did with you." Elle said, "Fat chance. We should take him out so we don't have to worry about him hurting another soul." That is when a shadowy figure went up to Sasquatch and grabbed his Leo saber. Twinkle said, "Don't mind if I do." Then they ran up to Miriam and started to fight her. Elle said, "Lady Miriam, take him out." Miriam said, "What do you think I'm doing?" Twinkle said, "Stalling for time." Pollyanna said, "Wait, is that Twinkle?" Sasquatch said, "Huh?" Miriam said, "So you're the Rigetti that Wilfred was after." Twinkle said, "You know I'm kind of sick of hearing about me being a target." Sasquatch said, "I'd like to know what you're doing with my Leo saber." Twinkle said, "Miriam, you want to rumble? I'd think fast if I were you." Miriam said, "Oh, I'm scared. Dream on, you Rigetti failure." Sasquatch said, "Finish her!" Miriam said, "What?" Twinkle said, "Leo slash." That's when Miriam got knocked out of the tavern. Elle said, "Lady Miriam!" That's when one of the girls, Pollyanna, decided to attack Twinkle. Twinkle said, "What the heck?" Pollyanna said, "So, this is the twin of the chosen one, Rutchet. But how can that be?" Sasquatch said, "Let me at her." Nick said, "No, Twinkle has to prove himself." Pollyanna said, "You think you're going to have a chance against me? You have another thing coming." Twinkle said, "Says a burlesque dancer and an escort." Andrew said, "She's a what?" Twinkle said, "Dude, I would get checked if I were you, as she might have gave you stars." Sasquatch said, "Oh, come on, dude." Elle said, you didn't say that to me when we went into Shaman's Rigetti jet that one time. Miriam said, do me a favor and take them out. Nick said, really, dude? You did that? Andrew said, and you thought I was a perv. Sasquatch said, you still are, deputy. What creep plays patty cake with her cheeks? Elle said, the pet lion strikes back. Maya said, I knew you would say that. Elle said, Maya, I can explain. Muku said, you better explain fast. Sasquatch said, why I oughta. Nick said, hey, chill out, Rigetti. Maya said, more like the pet lion needs a litter box. Twinkle said, return of the preschooler. Muku said, that is my thing. Twinkle said, okay, Rigetti brothers. Maya said, where is that Rigetti brother of yours? It would be sad if I destroyed his twin. Twinkle said, you wouldn't dare, Maya. Meanwhile, Argo and Hannah are pursuing Delilah and her gang. Delilah said, is that who I think it is? Diana said, holy cow, I hope Deborah got those parts from the Rigetti Warriors Rigetti jet. Argo said, oh, crud. Hey, Sasquatch, Twinkle, are you in there? We need to talk. Sasquatch said, we're busy at the moment. Argo said, I think Deborah took your friend's parts from his Rigetti jet. Twinkle said, Rutchets, are you kidding me? Argo said, do I look like I'm kidding? Nick said, hey, little missy, I think you and your friend here are under arrest. Maya said, you and what army? Nick said, turn yourself in or else. That's when Maya started to twist Nick's arm. Maya said, or else what? Nick said, deputy, I need help here. Anytime. Sasquatch said, dude, your friend needs help. Andrew said, I'm in a bit of a situation. Maya said, maybe he needs that pink stuff. Andrew said, haha, very funny. Elle said, deputy, give yourself up or your sheriff friend will get it. Twinkle said, we need to confront Delilah and you threaten him? Nick said, you're as worse as my deputy. Twinkle said, break his wrist. I dare you. Elle said, shut up, Rigetti. Twinkle said, I would love to see you break his wrist. Go ahead. Nick said, you're not making this better. Sasquatch said, play along, Sheriff. Nick said, what do you mean by that? Go ahead and break my wrist, Maya. You'll be arrested with assault to an officer. Maya said, not much of one if the deputy of yours is a coward. Andrew said, take that back, Maya. Elle said, she don't have to do anything, deputy. Miriam said, just do it already. Pollyanna said, Larry Merriam, thank the stars you're alive. Meanwhile, Argo and Hannah continued their pursuit of Delilah and Diana. Diana said, it's going to be lead. Argo said, what in the world? Hannah said, hold on tight. Argo said, you don't have to tell me twice. Delilah said, take the wheel, Diana. I got this. That's when Delilah aims her pistol at Hannah. Argo said, Hannah, look out. That is when Delilah blasted at Hannah, but Argo blocked the blast with her Rigetti shield. Delilah said, how did I miss? Slow the vehicle down. I got a plan. Hannah said, are they slowing down? Argo said, I don't like the sound of this. Meanwhile, back in the village tavern, Elle said, it's over for you. Give up, Rigetti. Andrew said, why don't you escort? Maya said, yeah, the kind you like. Nick said, wow, Maya. I command you on the sarcasm. Maya said, really, fool? Nick said, not a fool like you. That's when Twinkle blasts Maya with his Rigetti blast, but she throws Nick into the blast, knocking him to the ground. Twinkle said, what in the heck? Maya said, oh, did that miss? Nick said, this won't. That's when Maya sees that the sheriff, Nick, caught the blast in time, but was knocked off his feet. Maya said, impossible. Twinkle said, maybe he'll blast you with it. Muku said, oh no, he won't. That's when Muku attacked Nick, but Nick started to defend himself until Maya stopped Muku and Nick in the middle of the fight. Maya said, let the escorts deal with our enemy. They won't last long with Miriam and her gang. Twinkle said, at least Elle didn't mind you making out with her in front of that deputy. Maya said, at least I wasn't your friend over there wearing pretty pink princess panties. Sasquatch said, I think you would like them. Maya said, you're so hideous with those panties on. Sasquatch said, you would like them. Sparkle, sparkle. Andrew said, wow. Nick said, oh, like you didn't wear the escort's panties. Sasquatch said, what in the world? Andrew said, well, at least they didn't sparkle like yours. Twinkle said, wow, you're both sad. Nick said, trust me, it's like hell on wheels to get him to wear boxers again. Elle said, I feel violated by this. Twinkle said, me and you especially. Meanwhile, Delilah was inching closer to Argo and Hannah. Argo said, she's getting close. I'm going in. Diana said, what? That is when Argo knocked Delilah off the Rigetti cycle And Diana ran into a sand dune, making her fall off and rolled down the sand hill. Delilah said, "Oh no, Diana!" Argo said, "Where do you think you're going, Delilah?" Deborah said, "They're going with me. Do you have a problem with that, Rachetti?" Hannah said, "Oh dear." Meanwhile, back at the village tavern, Elle said, "It's time for you to die, deputy." Andrew said, "That's not what you said when you wanted me to play patty cake with them cheeks." Sasquatch said, "Enough of them jokes, fool." Twinkle said, "That's why you're in trouble to begin with." Argo said, "Help! Twinkle!" Hannah said, "Help us!" Nick said, "Hannah! Hannah!" Andrew said, "This is for reals. You're sick." Miriam said, "You didn't pay us, so you will die." That's when Nick shook his head back and forth in shame. Andrew said, "Alrighty, how much do I owe you?" Pollyanna said, Miriam said 33.4% for her. Elle said 33.3% for her, and I get 33.3% as well. "What the heck, Miriam? Why do you always get 0.1% more than us?" Andrew said, "That doesn't answer my question." Sasquatch said, "It means you need to pay attention to your math." Elle said, "I would pay attention to your mouth." Maya said, "Well, Miriam gets 3,400 Ragetti orbs, while Elle and Pollyanna get 3,300 Ragetti orbs apiece." Nick said, "So you owe them 10,000 Ragetti orbs? You're screwed, buddy." Sasquatch said, "Listen, he might have been a douche to you, but at least let him work off the debt by doing something for you." That's when Miriam and her escort had something in mind. Andrew said, "Do I have to?" "Fine, I'm taking my shirt off." Nick said, "Now strip down to your panties and say I'm a perv. I need help." Andrew said, "I'm not going to do that." Nick said, "Then let the butt whooping begin." Elle said, "Oh, this is going to be fun." And Andrew said, "Are you serious?" "Fine. I'm a perv and I need help. Are you happy?" Nick said, "You're not down to Elle's panties." Sasquatch said, "Really, Sheriff?" Andrew said, "I'm not doing it." That's when Sasquatch pulled down his pants to where he was only in women's panties. Sasquatch said, "Ooh la la." Twinkle said, "Now the sheriff wants you to do it as well." Sasquatch said, "I'm not doing that." Elle said, "Come on, Ragetti, are you chicken?" Twinkle said, "Do it for Argo. Do it for Izzy. Do it for his barber, Miss Hannah." That's when Nick gave Twinkle that look. Twinkle said, "What?" Sasquatch said, "I'm not doing it, and that's that." That's when Elle went up to Sasquatch and pulled down his pants to see that he was wearing pretty pink princess panties. Nick said, "Maya wasn't joking." Maya said, "So long, suckers. Come on, Muku. I ain't got all day to look at the pretty lion." Sasquatch said, "Ha ha, very funny, Maya." Nick said, "Okay, Maya, you and Muku are under arrest for it." But Nick was too late as Maya and Muku made their escape in their fighter jet. Nick said, "What in the world? Hey, you come back here, cowards!" But Sasquatch, you could have done better. Twinkle said, "Hey, Sheriff, we need to go save our friends. And I'm talking about your friend the barber and our friend the Ragetti warrior from Delilah and her gang." Sasquatch said, "Can I pull up my pants now?" Nick said, "You and my deputy have endured enough humiliation for a lifetime." Elle said, "You're my favorite, Sasquatch." Twinkle said, "I don't think you want to get mixed up with a Ragetti warrior like him." Elle said, "He sounds like a total gentleman. Unlike that deputy, he doesn't hold a candle to Sasquatch." Miriam said, "I'm sorry about that. Come on, Elle. We got people to entertain, and they got a mission to accomplish." Twinkle said, "See ya." Miriam said, "And don't come back, you hear? You really scare off our business." Nick said, "Come on, you guys. We have some people to save." Twinkle said, "Come on, pretty pink princess panties." Sasquatch said, "Don't make me take them off and shove them in your mouth." Twinkle said, "Oh, heck no. I don't want that in my mouth. Besides, you might have left streaks." Sasquatch said, "I didn't even floss them, so knock it off." Nick said, "Come, now!" Sasquatch said, "That is what we get for fooling around." So Sasquatch, Twinkle, Nick, and Andrew go and search for Hannah and Argo. Of course, on their way to find them, Nick finds Hannah's Ragetti cycle. Nick said, "Is that Hannah's Ragetti cycle?" Twinkle said, "Holy cow, where are they then?" Andrew said, "Oh, Nick, think we got company." Delilah said, "I think we got you where we want you." Sasquatch said, "Where's my friend's parts for his Ragetti jet, or else?" Diana said, "Or else what, fool?" Twinkle said, "You know my brother will hunt you down and destroy you." Deborah said, "An idle threat from a Ragetti warrior." Sasquatch said, "It ain't a threat. It's a promise." Delilah said, "What if we refuse? Then Ratchet will come after us?" "I doubt it." Diana said, "Listen, as all of us want to argue, I think we should take it inside our hideout." Nick said, "She isn't lying. This isn't the safest area on the planet." Twinkle said, take us inside your hideout. Diana said, please, they're coming at any minute. Delilah said, fine, but if they do any funny business, it's going to be personal. That's when they went inside Delilah and her gang's hideout, and they were greeted to Argo and Hannah's faces. Sasquatch said, Argo. Nick said, Hannah. Twinkle said, let them go. Diana said, first things first, let's talk business. Argo said, first thing before we talk business, let me and Hannah free so we can trust you that we won't be harmed while in your custody. Hannah said, I think we should hear Delilah, Diana, and Deborah's plan before we jump to conclusions. Diana said, this is our plan. Sasquatch said, listen, whatever plan you have, it will fail. Diana said, then what do you have, King of the Jungle? That's when Sasquatch growled at Diana. Twinkle said, I think we should have you turn me to Ricardo. And when he is not expecting it, we fool him and go after Izzy and get her out of the airship before they capture us. Diana said, or they capture all of us and Ricardo can interrogate you, Twinkle, into telling him where your brother is, endangering the Rigetti warriors. Delilah said, pretty much we're screwed either way. Nick said, or we can have you under arrest for grand theft. Twinkle said, and attempting to take a transport of gold. Andrew said, they got you there. Diana said, I want to know why we have a transport of gold on this planet, as it's pretty dangerous where it's being transported to. Delilah said, did you ever think why we wanted to take a transport full of gold for? Twinkle said, did you think of who has a stock in that company and what would happen if you did anything to those people's bottom line? Delilah said, big deal. At least we get something for our troubles while they suffer for their foolishness. Argo said, well, let's say that you gave Twinkle to Ricardo and he commands you on the job. He might destroy you before you get a chance to leave his airship alive. Diana said, then what do you suggest we do about this? Argo said, for one, you can untie us, and two, if we work together, we can outsmart Ricardo, Muku, and Maya at their little game. Diana said, and if the plan fails, Argo said, then we're done for, especially our friend Izzy. Sasquatch said, I think we need to come up with a plan that's foolproof, that will succeed in the end. Argo said, you're right, Sasquatch, can you do me a favor? Nick said, what is that? Argo said, can he come over here and untie us? Delilah said, over my dead body. Nick said, blaster ready. Diana said, stop it. Here, I'm going to untie her. Argo said, thank goodness you could untie me. Hannah said, what about me? Argo said, we'll get to you soon. Right now, let me work with Delilah and Regain on how we can approach our plan the right way. Hannah said, or you have Diana untie me before I charge her for nearly hurting my scalp when she pulled my hair. Diana said, well, you do have some soft, amazing head of hair. Nick said, that is not the point. Diana said, she has soft, amazing hair. Like if it was a pillow, I would lay on it. Hannah said, I know my head would be hurting for a while. Argo said, Diana, Deborah, and Delilah, you have to trust us on this one. Deborah said, trust you? Fat chance. That's when Diana grabbed out Deborah's dagger and slashed at the ropes, freeing Hannah. That's when Hannah gave Argo a big hug. Hannah said, thanks, I owe you. Argo said, you should be thanking Diana for getting you out of that rope. Hannah said, I don't thank Amazons. Argo said, Hannah, really? Hannah said, fine, I guess I'll thank her for once, since she works with a bad crowd. Deborah said, excuse me? You know what? You're going to die with the Rigettis. Sasquatch said, not if we take you out first. Diana said, stop it. This is not going to solve anything. That's when they got a knock on the door. Delilah said, hey, who is it? Wilfred said, who do you think it is? Sandy Claus? Deborah said, how did they know we were here? Delilah said, hey, computer, check for any tracking signatures around our hideout. Tech Intelligence Max said, tracking signatures inside 3 of the Rigetti cycles. That is when Wilfred charged up his blaster. That's when Wilfred blasted at TIM when he said too much. Wilfred said, so, you know he had tracking signatures put into our Rigetti cycles. Sadly, you had to have one of your own destroyed, or you would have been able to destroy the Rigetti by now. Hager said, now do us a favor. Surrender the Rigetti and you won't get hurt. Emmanuel said, shut it, fool. You also say the stupidest things at times. That's when Sasquatch decided to do an impression of Diana. Sasquatch said, no Ragetti here. Wilfred said, then who do I see with you, huh? That's when Twinkle decided to do an impression of Argo. Twinkle said, I don't know what you're talking about. Argo said, Twinkle, come here. That's when Argo backhanded Twinkle upside the head. Twinkle said, hey, what was that for? That's when Twinkle realized he screwed up. Twinkle said, oops. Wilfred said, I knew it! The Ragetti is in there! Surrender the Ragetti or I'll blow this place sky high. Diana said, not by the hair of Debbie's chinny chin chin. Deborah said, where? I don't see any. That's when Deborah looked at Diana for saying that. Deborah said, really? Hagar said, I knew those ladies had some peach fuzz on them. Argo said, watch it, fool. Sasquatch said, hey, your peach fuzz makes you unique. Argo said, really? Because I don't have any. Deborah said, smooth move, Axlax. Wilfred said, ready to blow it down. That's when Diana decides to surrender herself. Diana said, I'm so sorry, Wilfred, but they're not here. Wilfred said, but I just heard voices. Diana said, of course you hear voices. I was doing impressions of them inside the hideout. So how did I do? Hagar said, well, your timing was off, but it could need some more work. Emmanuel said, shut up, you. Wilfred said, okay, so I want to hear some impressions of Delilah. Diana said, I don't know if I could do that. That's when Wilfred looked at the window and noticed that a shadow was hanging out the wall. Wilfred said, you sure about that? Diana said, hi, my name is Delilah, and I'm the leader of the gang. Sasquatch said, are you going to let her do that to you? That's when Delilah gave Sasquatch that look. Diana said, oh, my name is Wilfred, and I love collecting bounties and keeping the money for myself. That's when Wilfred growled at Diana. Hagar said, is that true, boss? Are you keeping the money for yourself? Emmanuel said, you know what? That's when Emmanuel punches Hagar in the face and Hagar falls to the ground. Wilfred said, that is what you get for asking me why I keep the whole bounty to myself. That's when Emmanuel pulled out his blaster and aimed it at Wilfred. Diana said, well, it looks like your game is against you now. Emmanuel said, not as much as you hating me for this. Diana was struggling to get out of his arms. And Twinkle said, what is he doing to Diana? Deborah said, oh, he's mine. Argo said, you can't go out there alone without a plan. That's when Deborah was getting concerned and had to move fast. Deborah said, but he's manhandling her. Twinkle said, I'm going out there. Argo said, Twinkle, stop. Twinkle said, let her go. I'm the one you're after. Diana said, no, Twinkle, I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to put an end to Tavern. Argo said, what? Sasquatch said, so, that's who you work for. Why doesn't Ricardo do it himself? That's when Tavern's fighter jet arrived. Wilfred said, speak of the devil, he would love to see the Ragetti he's capturing. Tavern said, wait, so this is the Ragetti's twin brother, Twinkle? Sasquatch said, I heard about you. You work for Ricardo? Tavern said, and they work for me. Argo said, pathetic. Tavern said, is that Argo? I heard about your escape from Ricardo. Weren't you an entertainer for a general named Antonpant? Argo said, what did you say? Tavern said, I didn't say anything. Argo said, liar. Twinkle said, well, whoever you talked about, you know he wouldn't give a rat's wazoo. Sasquatch said, you sound like an ignorant fool. Why don't you prove you have the guts and fight? Tavern said, I've heard enough. Wilfred, Hagar, and Emmanuel, relieve them of the Ragetti. Deborah said, you can't do that. He's our bounty. Delilah said, will you shut up? Tavern said, Emmanuel, do me the honor and kill them. Sasquatch said, you coward. You wouldn't last a day in our shoes. Tavern said, it's on, Ragetti. No one gets away with that insult. Argo said, whoop his assets, Sasquatch. Tavern said, we will see who whips whose assets, Missy. Argo said, my name is... Tavern said, blah, blah, blah. Who cares, Dancer 69? That's when Twinkle looked at Argo with that weird look. Argo said, what are you looking at? Twinkle said, you were Dancer 69? Boy, that's priceless. Sasquatch said, shut up, Twinkle. I'm trying to concentrate. That's when Tavern attacked Sasquatch, but they were in defense mode. Tavern said, wait, you call yourself a Ragetti warrior and you can't pay attention to a single thing I do. Twinkle said, listen to me. Tavern can't hold a candle to you. Tavern said, hey, will someone shut that Ragetti up? Sasquatch said, maybe I'll shut you up. That's when Hagar hands Tavern his battle staff. Deborah said, Sasquatch, catch! Hagar said, oh no you don't. That's when Delilah blasted at Hagar with her blaster. Sasquatch grabbed his Leo's saber and knew what he had to do. Sasquatch said, cool it. I have this. That's when Deborah throws her battle staff to Sasquash. Traven said, any last words? Sasquatch said, yeah, you're finished. Argo said, ooh, need some ice for that burn? So Sasquatch and Traven battle it out with their battle staffs while everyone watches them battle it out. Meanwhile, on Ricardo's airship, Maya went to visit Izzy's cell block. Maya said, it looks like the pet lion is facing off with Traven. Izzy said, it can't be. Maya said, ooh, is the virginity girl gonna cry? Oh, boo-hoo. Izzy said, if I get out of here, I'll hurt you, Maya. Ricardo said, knock it off, Maya. Lucas said, the virginity girl don't need you taunting her. Ricardo said, can you do me a favor? Lucas said, anything, Master Ricardo, name it. Ricardo said, can you zip it? Maya said, well, at least someone told you off. Ricardo said, zip it too, Maya. Izzy said, how's it feel? Maya said, feel this. That's when Maya used her powers on Izzy. Ricardo said, Maya, knock it off, or I'll do the same thing to you. I mean it. That's when Maya knew Ricardo meant business. So she let Izzy go. Maya said, you're lucky that Ricardo had your back this time. Hope that I don't get you at the right moment. Ricardo said, Maya, let the prisoner suffer. She ain't going nowhere. That's when Izzy knew she would need a prayer if she was going to be saved by Sasquatch and the others. End of chapter. If you enjoyed this audiobook chapter, do yourself a favor and click the like button. Subscribe to this channel and support the cause at patreon.com/RogettiWarriors by Retro Films. And until next time, peace and subscribe.